All right, this is the last little section of the notes where there were a couple of problems with food webs. And I wanted to make sure that you understood how these are structured. So when you're looking at a food web, make sure that you understand that the organisms at the bottom are typically going to be your producers, right? So in this picture, that would be our seaweed and our plant plankton. Sometimes they don't actually have the names of the organisms, they just have like A, B, C, but we're kind of assuming that as we go up here, this is showing how kind of the flow of energy, right? So the chitin, for example, eats the seaweed. The crab eats the chitin. All right, so let's look at the question. So name a primary consumer. So the primary consumers are the ones who eat the producers. So remember, our producers are our photosynthetic organisms at the bottom. So primary consumers, there's a couple of them, but let's just include a couple these. We'll include the shrimp and the chitin. Technically the mussel also. So shrimp, chitin. Again, you could have also said the mussel because they eat the plant plankton. If the seaweed contained a metal poison, which organisms would end up with the most metal stored in their body? So remember, the deal with metal poisons, heavy metals, is that they build up. You can't eliminate them, right? So you would originally think, oh, maybe the seaweed because it's got the direct exposure. But that's actually not going to be your answer because you're assuming that this is kind of dilute levels that are not necessarily enough to kill the seaweed or the plankton, but they're going to absorb it. And if they absorb it, it's going to become stuck in their tissues and they're not going to be able to eliminate it. So what that means is when the shrimp, for example, eats the seaweed, they're going to get all the toxins that have built up in the seaweed, and those are now going to get stuck in the shrimp. And remember, one shrimp needs to eat a lot of seaweed, and one sea anemone eats a lot of shrimp. So what's going to end up happening in these situations is that the further up you go, the more buildup, this stuff is going to become more and more and more concentrated. And so the ones that are going to be the most affected are going to be the ones at the top. So the seagull would be a very obvious example of one that would be most affected because one seagull eats a lot of mussels and a lot of crabs. And those things eat all these things beneath them. And so these toxins become more and more concentrated. Technically, I would agree that starfish might also be a good answer to this because the starfish is eating the rock cod, which eats the chitins, which eats the seaweed. But that's the important thing, is that you're picking a top consumer. If all the chitins died, who would be most affected? So what makes the most sense here, let me erase my work. If the chitins were to die, we cross them off. No chitins. Shrimp might be affected, but the thing with the shrimp is that they eat other things, right? They eat seaweed, they eat plankton, so they probably just eat more seaweed and plankton, which might throw off the balance of the ecosystem, but they're not going to be the ones affected first. The real ones affected are going to be the crabs and the rock cod originally, because they eat chitins and that's their only food source. So the first ones that would be affected would be the crab and the rock cod. Now, you might also say that later on, if the rock cods die, the sea anemone and starfish would also be affected, right? Because they eat the rock cod, and the rock cods are going to die because of the chitin dying. So we can see that this could cause an entire collapse of the ecosystem eventually, but you want to pick probably the direct ones that they eat the chitin, and particularly pick ones that's their only source of food. All right, and then which organism would be a competitor of the mussel? So a competitor is somebody who eats the same thing. So if we find the mussel on here, well, that would be the shrimp. The shrimp would be a competitor of the mussel because they would be competing over the plant plankton because that's the food source for both of them. So that's how you would answer those questions. Here's a sample without names. So which letter is the producer? So your producer is going to be the one at the bottom. This is going to be your plant, your photosynthetic organism, or in a marine environment, this might be phytoplankton, things like that. But remember, this is the flow of energy. So people don't know how to read these. When there's names, it's easier. When there's no names, sometimes people get really confused. So producer is going to be your letter A. All right, which two organisms would compete for food source A as their only food? So in other words, who eats A and would compete? So that would be C, and that would be B, because D technically also eats B. So C and B would be competitors of each other because they are both eating A as their only food source. Top consumer. Again, usually we're looking for like something near the tip. and most of the arrows going there. So I would say G is the most obvious top consumer because all the arrows pretty much flow to G. You don't see any arrows coming out of G, right? Everything pretty much ends with G. Even E is eaten by G. And then who would be most affected by a loss of C? So if C dies, who's going to be most affected? F, because F eats C, and C is F's only source of food. And if F dies, that might throw off G, but G also eats D and E, so maybe not. So that's how you might read one that has letters instead of actual organisms. Make sure you understand that you got your producers, top consumers, and then everybody in between. It's the direction that the energy is flowing in the ecosystem. All right, and then this last little section is ecological succession. So primary succession is basically the first time anything grows in an area. And it sort of goes through stages. So like a new volcanic island, for example, a volcano creates new land that's never been land before. Typically what starts on these areas are going to be mosses and lichens. And the reason why is because they're sometimes called pioneer organisms. They produce acids that will break rock into soil. And once we have soil, that's when we can have a lot of other things. Now shrubs, trees, things like that will start to grow. And we will have an increase in diversity, which remember, higher diversity is a healthier and healthier ecosystem. And then it will end with what we call a climax community. And that's pretty much where it's sort of stabilized into a final set of organisms, plants, animals. You know, there's basically a full-blown ecosystem there. It doesn't necessarily have to end with hardwood trees. This is just one example, just so you know. And then secondary succession is the same thing, but it's coming back. So primary is because there's never been anything there, like a brand new volcanic island. Secondary would be like a recovery, like when there's a fire in the Everglades, and now we kind of have to start from scratch because everything in that area is back down to soil again. That would be secondary succession, kind of regrowing until eventually it gets back to the community that it was before. And that is it.